They found him there, the old German shepherd pressed close against the side of a crib, his body trembling with the kind of cold that has nothing to do with winter air. His fur was damp, clumped in places, the smell of rain still clinging to him. Each shallow breath rattled in his chest, and yet he would not move, not even when the door creaked open, not even when footsteps drew closer. His eyes, dark pools reflecting both fear and defiance, remained fixed on the tiny figure sleeping within the crib. It was as if he believed that if he shifted, even slightly, the fragile child might vanish. This was not where a dog was meant to be found. Not in a house half stripped of warmth, not in a room where plaster peeled from the ceiling and a single lamp on the dresser flickered like it wasn't sure it belonged. But there he was, curled low, ribs showing through a coat that once must have been proud. His body blocked the draught from the cracked window. His paws were drawn tight under him, as though bracing against a storm no one else could see. And the baby. The baby lay silent, chest rising and falling, with that peculiar rhythm that only infants know. The faintest sound, barely more than a sigh, slipped from her lips as she turned, unconcerned, toward the warmth of the shepherd's flank. She did not cry. She did not startle. Her tiny hand stretched into the air until her fingers brushed the coarse fur, and in that moment, his shaking eased. It was not comfortable, not really, but it was something like a tether. I wish I could tell you this story begins with joy, with bright daylight and laughter spilling through a window, but it does not. It begins here in this dim room with a dog who had no place left to go and a child too young to understand the gravity of what her presence meant. The sight alone is one I still cannot shake, a creature bred for strength, for loyalty, now reduced to little more than a husk, clinging to the side of innocence as if his very existence depended on it. And perhaps it did. The rain had been falling for hours outside. You could hear it in the way the gutters coughed water down the walls, in the occasional tap of a branch against glass. The storm had begun with violence, but now lingered like grief, softer, persistent. It was the kind of night where most people stayed hidden indoors seeking comfort. But inside this house, comfort was a word long forgotten. The air smelled faintly of mildew, of something left to rot. And yet within that crib, a fragile thread of life slept, untouched by the ruin. The shepherd had been there for hours, perhaps days. His eyes were red-rimmed, his tail unmoving, his ears flat against his skull. He listened for sounds that weren't there, the steady footsteps of someone who might return, the voice of someone who once called his name. But only silence answered. Silence, and the faint sound of a baby breathing. You may wonder how a dog finds himself here in such a state, unmoving, starving, guarding a crib that holds no promise for him. But the truth never arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, in scents that linger too long on fur, in scars that have healed without care, in the way his eyes widen at the sound of a slammed door, or the way his head turns at every distant engine. These pieces will come to us slowly. For now what matters is this: he stayed. Through cold, through hunger, through the slow erosion of his own body, he stayed. I remember the way the lamplight painted the room in shades of amber and shadow. The shepherd's breathing was uneven, as though every breath cost him something. But whenever the child stirred, his head lifted, his nose pressed gently to the slats of the crib, as if to reassure himself that she was still there, still safe. I could see the stains on the floorboards beneath him, the dried mud from nights spent outside, the faint trace of blood from a paw worn raw. He must have forced his way in somehow, through the broken latch on the back door, drawn by instinct or perhaps by something deeper. There was no food in the house, no water in sight, only the fragile bond of two lives pressed together by circumstance. The baby did not know the dog's history. She did not care for the marks of hardship etched into his body. She reached as only a child could reach, without judgment, without hesitation. Her small hand brushed against his fur again, and this time, though his body quivered from exhaustion, his eyes softened. He leaned into her touch. Stories like this don't begin with clarity. They begin with confusion, with the ache of questions that have no immediate answers. Why was the shepherd here? Who had left him? Why was he guarding a child that did not yet have the words to call his name? But in that first moment, None of those questions mattered. All that mattered was the silence they shared. The silence of a dog who had lost too much and a baby who had yet to lose anything. And somewhere in between, an invisible thread tied them together. I remember stepping closer, though every instinct told me not to disturb them. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and still he did not move. His gaze locked onto mine, wary, protective but not hostile. He was not a dog ready to attack. He was a dog ready to endure, ready to bleed if it came to that. And the baby, she did not stir at the sound. She only pressed her cheek deeper into her blanket, her fingers still tangled in fur. The shepherd's tail twitched once, barely perceptible. And then, in the quiet, I realized something. This wasn't the first night he had stayed here. No, this was a vigil. Some say animals cannot feel loyalty the way we do, that they act only out of instinct, survival, the echo of breeding. But I tell you this, no instinct could explain the way he held his body, shielding the crib from the draft, ignoring his own. Hunger to give warmth to a child who had none. It was not instinct that kept him there. It was devotion. A devotion born from loss, perhaps, or from memory. But devotion is all the same. That night, watching them, I felt something settle deep in my chest, a weight I did not expect. The kind of weight that comes when you realize you are standing on the edge of a story you cannot yet understand, but one you know will change you. This story is not about a rescue in the way you might expect. It is not about heroes arriving at the right time, or miracles unfolding with grand gestures. It is about the quiet, unrelenting presence of a creature who refused to let go. The shepherd stayed, and because he stayed, a bond was born. This story will break you, and then rebuild you. It is about loyalty found in the unlikeliest of nights, about a child too young to know she was saved, and a dog too scared to believe he was worthy of saving. Stay with me. Like, share, and tell us where in the world are you watching from today. The shepherd did not move when the storm outside finally broke. The rain slowed to a whisper, the gutters dripped with exhaustion, and a heavy quiet filled the air. But inside that dim room, the silence remained unchanged. His vigil continued, unwavering, relentless, as if the weather itself had no authority here. And yet the silence had a voice, not in words but in fragments, memories carried in the posture of his body, in the tremor of his breath. They did not come in order, nor did they explain themselves. They arrived like ghosts, shadows flickering across the walls of his mind. A man's boots pounding down wooden steps, a woman's quiet laugh fading too soon, the slam of a door that never opened again. Each sound left its trace, and though he could not speak them aloud, the shepherd carried them in every shiver that rippled through his body. He shifted at last, only slightly, adjusting so that his side pressed closer to the crib. The baby stirred, her small lips parting, her fingers curling tighter into the fur she had claimed as her own. His ribs expanded, then contracted with a slow exhale. For a moment his trembling paused. I watched from the doorway, unwilling to intrude. The room itself seemed fragile, as though one wrong step might fracture the spell. Dust clung to the curtains. The wallpaper peeled in long curling strips, revealing wood that had been forgotten beneath. The lamp hummed, uncertain of its own survival. But what struck me most was the smell. Not just of mildew and damp air, but of something older, an echo of smoke, faint yet unmistakable. It clung to the shepherd's coat, hidden beneath the rain-soaked musk. It was a scent that did not belong to this moment, yet carried the weight of all the moments that had led him here. Back then I didn't know his story. I only knew what his body confessed in silence. The scar that ran along his flank, pale and raised, a wound that had closed without tenderness. The stiffness in his hind leg when he shifted, as though each step he had taken to reach this room had demanded more than he had to give. The hollow look in his eyes when they wandered, searching the walls as if expecting to see faces that no longer remained. A dog does not grieve the way humans do, but grief was there, buried beneath his skin. The baby moved again, her hand, falling away from his fur. She let out a small whimper, not quite a cry, but enough to draw him upright. His ears flicked forward, his head bowed over her. A low whine escaped his throat, soft, almost pleading, and then he lowered himself again, nose pressed to the wooden slats until her tiny fingers, as if guided by instinct, brushed against him once more. The whimper ceased. It was then I realized she was not comforting him. He was the one begging for reassurance. Outside, the storm had left behind puddles that mirrored the dim light of the street lamp. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine roared, fading as quickly as it came. But the house remained untouched, forgotten. I thought of how he must have arrived here. Had he wandered the streets drawn by a memory he could not abandon? Had he broken into this house searching for something or someone that had already vanished? I pictured him pacing roads slick with rain, his paws raw against the asphalt. I imagined the way people must have turned their heads, dismissing him as just another stray, too battered to matter. They could not have known the weight he carried. They could not have seen how every step pressed him closer to this room, this crib, this fragile bond. The fragments grew louder in my mind as though the silence itself willed me to listen. A leash dropped, a voice raised in anger, the smell of smoke thick, suffocating, coating his lungs. And then, nothing but cold air. I saw it not as a clear story, but as pieces scattered across a floor. Pieces I would have to gather one by one. He lifted his head then, turning toward the doorway where I stood. His eyes locked onto mine. For the briefest moment I thought he would rise, challenge me, protect the child with the last strength in his bones. But he did not. He only looked long enough for me to see what lived behind those eyes. Fear, yes, but also expectation. As if he had been waiting for someone, as if every sound of footsteps, every creak of the house might finally deliver the figure he longed to see. And when it was only me, his gaze faltered, lowering once again to the crib. The baby let out a sudden laugh in her sleep, a sound so pure, so startling. It cut through the heaviness like light through dust. The shepherd's ears perked. His tail shifted, the faintest motion, uncertain and hesitant. And for the first time, that night I thought I saw something flicker in him. Not joy, not yet, but memory. Perhaps once, long ago, he had heard that same sound from another crib. Perhaps once he had been told he was family. And though the faces had vanished, though the house itself bore scars of abandonment, he could not release that role. He was still the guardian, still the shadow at the crib, even if no one asked him to be. I stepped further into the room, careful to keep my movements slow. The shepherd's head lifted again, but he did not growl. He only tracked me with eyes. That had seen too much. The floor groaned beneath my weight, and dust stirred in the beam of lamplight. The smell of smoke seemed stronger now, as if disturbed by my presence. I wondered if it had seeped into the walls themselves, refusing to leave just as he refused. When I reached the crib, I looked down at the baby, her face softened by the dim glow, her breath steady. Her tiny hand still clung to fur she could not see but felt, and I thought of how she would one day be told this story, though she would never remember it. A story of how a dog who had nothing left still chose to stay. The shepherd shifted once more, curling his body into a tighter shape, as though he could wrap the crib in his own skin. His ribs rose and fell, the tremor never fully leaving. And yet in his stillness I felt something undeniable. This was not a chance, not a coincidence. Whatever roads had brought him here, whatever grief had carved his body hollow, it had all led to this moment. The dog and the child, two lives bound in silence, needing nothing but the presence of the other. I lingered, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace. The night stretched on, marked only by the rhythm of rain dripping outside, the hum of the lamp, the gentle breaths of a child. And in the center of it all the shepherd remained, a sentinel, a mourner, a survivor. And though his story had not yet been told, I knew it lived in the way his body curved protectively, in the scars he carried, in the quiet devotion that held him tethered to a crib in a forgotten room. The past is never gone. It lingers in the air we breathe, in the scars we bear, in the silence we cannot escape. For the shepherd it lingered in every shadow of that house, every breath that caught in his throat. And though I did not yet know his history, I could feel it pressing against the walls, waiting to be remembered. That night, as I stood in the doorway and watched him keep his vigil, I understood one thing. The shepherd had not come here to be saved. He had come here because he could not let go, and in that truth the weight of his past began to take shape, not in words, but in fragments that demanded to be pieced together. The baby sighed once more, turning in her sleep. Her hand slipped from his fur, yet his body leaned closer still, as if unwilling to let the connection fade. And I knew then this was only the beginning. The shepherd's story was not yet spoken, but it lived in every breath of that night. And soon, piece by piece, it would unfold. Section 3. The Weight of Scars. The shepherd slept in fragments, never fully surrendering to rest. His ears twitched with every creak of the house, every sigh of the storm still wandering beyond the windows. His body remained pressed close to the crib, ribs brushing wood with each uneven breath. It was not the sleep of peace. It was the restless drift of someone who feared what dreams might bring. I sat in a chair near the doorway, unable to leave. The air hung heavy with dampness, carrying the faint odor of smoke and mildew, but beneath it was another scent, one that clung closer to him. A metallic tang, faint but familiar. Blood. Not fresh, not open, but old. A scar's echo. The shepherd's side rose and fell, and in the pale glow of the lamp, I could trace every mark carved into his skin. Each scar was its own language, its own confession. One across his flank, jagged as if made by something sharp and careless. Another along his foreleg, smoother, older, the kind that comes from wire or chain. And the faintest burn mark near his ear, a patch where fur had never grown back. He carried history etched into his flesh, yet no one had been there to witness it but him. The baby stirred, a tiny hand lifting into the dark. As if by instinct, the shepherd lowered his head, letting her fingers graze his muzzle. The contact steadied him, pulling him from the edge of whatever shadows haunted his rest. His eyes opened, finding hers even though she had not truly woken. There was something unspoken in that exchange, something primal, beyond language. She needed safety she could not name. He needed belonging he could not demand. And somehow, they gave it to each other. The room itself seemed to breathe with them. Dust drifted lazily in the lamplight, settling on furniture too old to shine. A baby blanket lay crumpled in the crib, faded and fraying at the edges, but still carrying the scent of warmth. The shepherd pressed his nose against it, inhaling deeply, before settling again at her side. It was at that moment I began to imagine how he had arrived at this fragile bond, not as a stray stumbling by chance, not as a creature seeking shelter from rain, but as something more deliberate, more tethered. Perhaps once this house had been filled with voices. Perhaps once he had been called a name here, fed scraps from the kitchen floor, trained to guard these very walls. Perhaps once he had known this crib not as a place of exile, but as part of a family he believed would never vanish. And then, one night, something changed. The scent of smoke grew heavier the longer I stayed in that room. It clung not only to the shepherd, but to the very wood, the curtains, the faint grooves of the crib's frame. I could almost see it in the air curling upward, choking light. I imagined him there, trapped in a night of fire, the crackle of flames, the sharp sting of heat, the sound of shattering glass. And through it all, his body pressed against a door, his paws clawing at the frame, refusing to abandon the cries inside. Was it a real memory, or only what the room whispered to me? I could not say, but the scars on his body told me fire had licked him once, that he had borne it, not fled from it. Perhaps he had dragged someone out, perhaps he had failed, and the weight of that failure, real or imagined, had never left him. The baby shifted again, her lips parting in a soft murmur, the language of sleep. The shepherd's ears flicked forward, catching every sound. He bent closer, nose brushing her tiny wrist, as though reminding himself that she was here, that this one, at least, was alive. I could see the exhaustion in him. His body quivered from the effort of simply being. His paws splayed awkwardly, as if joints ached too much to fold. Yet no matter how hollow he looked, he held himself there. This was not instinct alone, this was a vow. I leaned back in the chair, my own thoughts drifting. I tried to imagine the life of a shepherd like him before all of this. A proud stance. Fur thick and clean, head held high at someone's side. The kind of dog neighbors admired. The kind children reached for without fear. He must have been loved once. His scars were not the marks of neglect alone. They were the marks of sacrifice. A body given willingly to shield, to guard, to endure. But love too had its shadows. For if he had been loved, then he had also been left, and in the hollow left behind, he had carried only his loyalty. That loyalty had dragged him back here, even when no one else remained. The night pressed, on stretching like an endless ribbon. Each hour felt slower than the last, marked only by the steady rise and fall of a baby's breath and the restless tremors of a dog who refused to close his eyes. Sometimes his ears pricked at sounds beyond the walls, a car horn, a distant voice, the shuffle of wind through broken shutters. Each time he tensed, waiting. Each time his body seemed to whisper, "Is it them?" And each time disappointment weighed him back down. It was nearing dawn when the light outside began to soften, turning the edges of the window grey. The storm had left the world hushed, as if the sky itself was weary. In the half-light I saw the shepherd's head rise again, his gaze fixed on the crib. His eyes dark, hollowed by time, softened as he watched her stir. There was no question in them, no demand, only a kind of reverence. I realized then that he was not simply guarding her. He was seeking absolution. Whatever ghosts he carried fire, loss, abandonment, they had driven him here, and in the silent presence of a child who knew nothing of his past, he sought redemption. The baby yawned, her tiny arms stretching wide, fingers curling. She blinked once, barely. Awake, and her gaze brushed past me, settling instead on the figure beside her crib. No words, no recognition, but her hand reached outward, unshaken. The shepherd leaned closer, pressing his muzzle against her palm. His tail thudded softly against the floorboards once, then twice. It was the first sound of joy he had allowed himself. I closed my eyes, letting the moment settle deep inside me, because this was no accident. The scars, the smoke, the hollow gaze, they all led here. And though the story had not yet unfolded in full, the truth was already written in the air. He had lost once, and he would not lose again. The room grew brighter with morning, though still muted by grey clouds. The shepherd remained in place. His body curled protectively, his scars hidden beneath the reach of a baby's hand. The past was not gone, it never would be. But for now, in that fragile space between night and day, he had found something that steadied him. Something worth enduring for. And I knew then the fragments of his story would not come all at once. They would arrive slowly through scars, through scents, through silent gestures. But each piece would carry us closer to understanding why he had chosen this crib, this child, this vigil. The baby let out a small sigh and drifted back into deeper sleep. The shepherd closed his eyes at last, leaning his head against the wooden slats. His trembling eased, if only for a moment, and in that stillness I saw it clearly. The weight of his scars was heavy, but the bond he had found was heavier still. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the dripping. Eaves and the scent of wet earth rising from the ground. Light seeped into the room reluctantly, filtered through heavy clouds and fractured curtains. It painted everything in muted greys, as though the world itself was hesitant to intrude on the fragile silence inside. The shepherd stirred first. His ears flicked at the faint creak of pipes, the distant groan of the house waking with the day. His ribs expanded in a long, tired breath, and his eyes opened not with surprise, but with the dull awareness of someone who had not truly slept. He rose halfway, his body slow and stiff, before lowering himself again beside the crib. His muzzle pressed against the slats, and he exhaled a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for a sigh. And then the child moved. Her tiny fingers flexed, opening and closing in the air, as though searching for something that had once been there. She blinked, lashes damp from sleep, her eyes unfocused but restless. Her mouth opened, releasing not a cry, but a soft murmur, the kind of half-formed sound that belongs only to infants, unshaped by language but heavy with need. The shepherd's ears perked instantly. His head lifted, eyes locked on her as though the smallest sound was a call meant only for him. He nosed closer, his breath brushing the blanket. The baby turned, her gaze unsteady but certain, and for the first time in daylight she truly saw him. It was a moment so small it could have gone unnoticed. A simple glance, a child's gaze resting on the figure beside her. But in that gaze the room shifted. Her lips parted, and the faintest smile flickered across her face. Not wide, not yet, but enough. Enough to draw from the shepherd something that had long been buried. His tail moved slow at first, then steadier, tapping against the floorboards in a rhythm almost reverent. The sound was soft, but in the stillness of that room, it was everything. I watched as she reached, her hand uncoordinated, fingers curling, and uncurling in the air until they landed on his muzzle. Her touch was clumsy, unrefined, but it carried no fear. She tugged gently at the coarse fur, and though it must have stung, the shepherd did not flinch. Instead, he lowered himself further, eyes half closing as though surrendering to her claim. His body remained tense with exhaustion, yet within that single gesture, I saw something shift. This was no longer simply a vigil. It was the beginning of trust. The house seemed to lean into their bond. The broken wallpaper, the sagging ceiling, the hollow quiet of abandoned rooms, it all faded in that instant. What remained was only the crib, the child, and the shepherd, who refused to leave. Her side. She giggled, then a sudden burst of joy, pure and untainted. It startled the air, cutting through the weight of silence like sunlight through mist. The shepherd froze, ears perked high, tail halting mid-motion. His eyes widened, almost disbelieving, and then slowly his body loosened. His tail thudded again, more surely this time. The sound of her laughter had awakened something in him that hunger, scars, and grief had not been able to erase. I found myself holding my breath, unwilling to disturb what was unfolding. It was as though the child had reached into the hollow places of the shepherd and touched something still alive, something he had thought long buried. She cooed, her tiny fingers brushing the scar near his ear. He leaned into it, not pulling away, as if even her clumsy touch could soothe wounds older than she would ever understand. And I realized then she did not see the scars. She did not smell the smoke. She did not sense the weight of abandonment that bent his body low. She saw only him. The light grew brighter outside, though it never reached the sharpness of full sun. The world remained muted, as though honoring the fragile bond being born inside the room. The shepherd stretched out one paw, laying it against the base of the crib. His claws scraped softly against the wood, not in menace, but in anchor. The child's hand fell against it, small fingers dwarfed by the sheer size of him, and yet she clutched at him with certainty, as though she had always known he would be there. That was the first true moment of connection, two beings, bound, not by words or promises, but by touch. I thought then of how easily this scene might have been lost, how the world beyond these walls would have dismissed him as a stray, too battered to matter, too scarred to be worth saving. How the child, too young to speak, might have been left unseen, her laughter unheard. But here they were, two forgotten lives, tethered by nothing more than presence. And in that presence, I saw something grow that could not be forced, could not be taught. It belonged. The baby's gaze lingered on him, her eyes brighter now, her body wriggling with new energy. She babbled incoherently, soft bursts of sound spilling into the air. Each one drew a response from him, not in words, but in the tilt of his head, the flick of his ears, the quiet rumble deep in his chest. They spoke in a language neither of them knew, yet both understood. It was not a coincidence. It was recognition. The morning stretched on, each moment heavier than the last in its quiet. Grace. The shepherd's body remained weary, trembling with the effort of endurance, but now he carried himself differently. His head lifted higher, his eyes steadier, his tail resting loosely against the floor as if the weight of vigilance had lessened. The child had given him something no one else could, a reason to stay, not out of duty, not out of grief, but out of connection. I sat watching, my own chest heavy with the weight of what I was witnessing. It is rare in life to see the precise Moment when two souls recognize each other, rarer still when neither can speak it aloud. But I saw it then, and I knew it was unshakable. The shepherd had chosen his vigil. The child had chosen her guardian. And nothing beyond those walls could undo what had been born in that fragile room. As the day wore on, the sounds of the world returned faintly, cars on wet streets, a distant shout, the hum of life beyond the silence. But here, within the peeling wallpaper and the flickering lamp, time slowed. The baby drifted back into sleep, her small hand still tangled in fur. The shepherd did not move. His body, though trembling, relaxed into her rhythm. His eyes closed not in fear, not in grief, but in surrender. For the first time, he allowed himself to rest. The light outside shifted toward the afternoon, pale and reluctant. The house remained still, the air thick with memory. And in that stillness, I understood their bond was no longer a question. It was a fact. The child had given him belonging. The shepherd had given her safety. And together they had begun to heal what neither could face alone. The scars were still there. The past was not erased. But in the touch of a baby's hand, in the sound of her laughter, something stronger had begun to take root. Not redemption, yet. Not forgiveness, yet. But hope. The shepherd exhaled deeply, his body finally surrendering to rest. The baby slept beside him, her hand still clinging to him, as though she knew no world without his presence. And as I watched them, I knew this was only the beginning. The story of their bond was not finished, it was only now being written. The first awakening had come, and soon it would change everything. Afternoon crept in quietly. The storm was gone now, leaving the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked wood and earth. A pale sun pressed faintly against the curtains, but its light seemed hesitant, as if unsure it belonged in this house where silence had made its home. The child slept, soundly in the crib, her breath steady, her fingers still curled around a patch of coarse fur that had not left her side. The shepherd lay beside her, motionless but awake, his ears twitching at every faint creak in the house. He had rested, yes, but not surrendered. His body was coiled still with instinct, as though even in safety, danger might walk through the door at any moment. Yet something had shifted. The line of his jaw was softer, the weight in his eyes less crushing. His tail rested lightly against the floor, no longer the rigid anchor of a sentinel, but the quiet tether of one who belonged. The hours passed, and then the baby stirred. She yawned a small sound, unremarkable to anyone else, but enough to make the shepherd's ears perk and his body lift. His gaze sharpened instantly, scanning her face for distress. There was none. She was only awake. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the dim light, and once again they found him. And once again she smiled. This time it was different. It was not the unfocused, sleepy curl of lips she had given that morning. This was brighter, fuller, a deliberate spark that lit her entire face. And for the first time the shepherd answered her with more than silence. A low rumble began in his chest, not the warning growl of an animal on guard, but the deep rolling sound of contentment, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the crib itself. The child squealed in delight, her arms flailing in clumsy joy. It was as if they had discovered their own game, his rumble, her laughter, back and forth, an exchange no one had taught them. I found myself leaning closer, listening to it unfold. It was not simply noise, it was language. The shepherd was speaking, the child was answering, and together they were building something unshakable. Her hands reached again, determined now, stretching through the narrow spaces of the crib's wooden slats. She grasped at his fur, tugging, not with harm, but with insistence. He leaned closer, pressing his muzzle against her small palm, accepting her touch fully. She cooed a bubbling stream of sounds that meant nothing and everything at once. Her voice filled the room, soft but steady, wrapping around the shepherd's ears like a melody he had long forgotten. He listened. He truly listened. His eyes softened, his breath steadied, and I realized he was not simply enduring her presence, he was answering it on his own. The house bore witness. Its silence no longer felt hollow, no longer weighed with sorrow. Instead, it became a frame for the sounds of life returning: the giggle of a child, the rumble of a dog, the shuffle of paws against worn floorboards. It was subtle, almost fragile, but it was changed. The child's world was expanding, and the shepherd was at its center. By late afternoon she was fully awake, wriggling and babbling with the restless energy of infancy. The shepherd rose at last, stretching stiff limbs, his body trembling slightly with the effort. He shook once, a rough shudder that sent dust motes dancing through the faint light, and then paced a small circle before returning to her side. He could have wandered. He could have sought food, water, or rest elsewhere in the house, but he did not. Every step returned him to her. She had begun to notice his movements now. Her eyes followed him wherever he went, her small body twisting, to track him as though her world had found a new axis. When he lay back down, she let out a squeal of triumph, as though she had won something just by watching him return. And in a way she had, for he was not hers by command. He was hers by choice. I could not help but marvel at how quickly trust had taken root. It had not been coaxed, not instructed, it had simply happened. Two souls scarred in different ways, recognizing each other without hesitation. The baby's giggles filled the room again, as he lowered his head fully into her reach. She patted his muzzle with clumsy, uncoordinated hands. Where another dog might have pulled away, might have grown restless, he remained still, patient, enduring, almost reverent. It was as if he knew the fragility of her touch, as if he understood that in her small hands there was no judgment, no expectation, only acceptance. The hours slipped by. The light dimmed toward evening once more, stretching, shadows across the walls, but within the room warmth remained. The shepherd had risen several times now, pacing, circling, returning again and again to the crib. Each time the baby reached, each time he answered. It became their rhythm, her calls, his presence, a cycle of need and response, growing stronger with each repetition. And with every exchange the scars on his body seemed less visible, not because they had faded, but because she never saw them in the first place. I began to wonder if the house itself felt it too. The air seemed lighter, the silence less suffocating. Where once there had been only echoes of abandonment, now there was the hum of belonging. The shepherd's vigil was no longer lonely, it was shared. And though neither of them could speak the words, I knew what they were building. It was family. Evening drew near. The sky outside deepened into muted colors, streaks of fading light pulling across the horizon. The baby grew drowsy again, her eyes heavy, her breath slowing. But this time as she drifted, she did not let go. Her tiny hand clung still to his fur, her grip weak but persistent. She would not release him even in sleep. And he, though weary, did not move away. He settled fully against the crib, his body curved protectively along its edge, as though shaping himself to its boundaries. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, syncing with hers. Together they went to sleep. I remained, in the stillness, the only witness to this fragile union. And as the last light faded from the room, I felt the weight of something profound. This was no longer a chance. It was no longer a stray dog keeping watch out of instinct, nor a child giggling at novelty. This was devotion, already growing roots, too deep to be undone. Night would come again, storms would return, the scars of the past would never fully vanish. But in this house of peeling walls and quiet shadows, something new had begun. The shepherd had found purpose. The child had found safety, and together they had found each other. Their story was not yet complete. It was still fragile, still uncertain, but in the rhythm of their breaths, in the grip of her hand on his fur, I saw a future being written, not yet revealed, not yet spoken, but waiting. And as the room darkened once more, I understood one truth that lingered like a heartbeat in the silence. This bond would not only endure, it would change everything. Night had settled fully over the house. The storm had long since passed, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing against broken shutters, the soft creak of aged wood settling into its own weight. The room felt smaller, intimate, cloistered, its boundaries defined by the crib, the lamplight, and the silent, watchful presence of the shepherd. He remained pressed close to the child, ribs rising and falling in careful rhythm with hers. His body trembled slightly, but no longer from fear or cold, or it was the trembling of fatigue, of muscles and joints long forced to endure, yet now tethered to something worth sustaining. The baby's fingers clung to his fur, gripping with unconscious insistence, and though she slept, she moved, as if aware of his presence, curling slightly toward him. The house itself seemed to breathe in response. Every groan of the floorboards, every distant sound from the night beyond the walls, was absorbed and softened by the stillness inside. For hours no one had entered the room, and yet the air carried the faintest echoes of the world outside, soft murmurs from down the hall, the occasional scrape of furniture from an adjoining room. The shepherd's ears twitched at each sound. He lifted his head once, alert, scanning the shadows. But his gaze returned immediately to the crib. Whatever may have entered or passed through, he was here for only one reason: to stay. I moved closer, carefully, watching them. The child's breath fogged the air in tiny clouds against the dim light of the lamp. The shepherd's muzzle brushed against her fingers, a slow, deliberate exhale of reassurance. Each movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he had been performing this vigil long before either of us existed to see it. And perhaps he had. In the depth of his eyes I glimpsed fragments of a past life, not just scars and soot, but memory. A long corridor filled with echoes of voices, hands that once reached for him in warmth, then withdrew, steps that receded into distance, and yet here he was, refusing to abandon a new life in need of protection. Outside the room, shadows shifted. A door down the hall squeaked. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, carried closer. Not the heavy, chaotic stomps of strangers, but quiet, deliberate someone moving through the house as though sensing it belonged. The shepherd lifted his head again, his ears flicked, nostrils flaring, his body tensed, muscles coiled for action. And yet he did not move toward the sound. Instead he stayed, guarding, waiting. The child stirred in her sleep, fingers curling tighter into his fur. He exhaled softly, almost a sigh, and leaned closer to her, grounding himself and her in the moment. The steps paused outside the doorway. A shadow flickered across the threshold, a hand perhaps brushing against the frame. The shepherd's gaze followed it, unwavering, assessing. There was caution there, not hostility. A quiet warning, the kind only a dog who has endured loss can issue without sound. The figure did not enter. Perhaps they sensed the bond, or perhaps they merely hesitated, aware of the sacred quiet of the room. The shepherd remained still, but every fiber of his being was aware. He could sense intent, even without movement. And in that silence, I realized something. He was not simply a guardian of flesh and blood. He was a guardian of trust. The baby shifted again, murmuring softly, and the shepherd responded. He lifted his head slightly, letting her hand brush against his ear, a small reassurance that the world outside the crib could not harm her. I thought of the lives that had passed through, his mind before this night, the hands that had left him, the voices that had vanished, the heat that had scarred him. All of it had led to this room, this child, this fragile equilibrium. Hours passed, the whispers in the house came and went, footsteps, the creak of doors, the faint sounds of distant life, and each time the shepherd reacted not with alarm, alone but with measured attention. He rose briefly, paced a short circle, then returned to the crib. Each movement was deliberate, each return deliberate reassurance. And the child, still barely aware, still too young to comprehend the weight of his actions, responded with instinctual calm. Her fingers stretched into his fur, her body curling toward him. She did not cry, she did not resist. She accepted, fully, the presence of this battered, weary guardian who had chosen her. I found myself reflecting on the nature of trust. It is not given lightly. It is earned quietly, in repeated gestures, in presence unbroken by fear or neglect. The shepherd had lived without trust for too long. The scars on his body, the fire that had marked him, the nights of hunger they had eroded it. And yet, here, in the presence of A being too small to demand, he began to allow it again. The baby did not know what she had given him, but he did, and it was enough. The night deepened. A faint chill settled into the room despite the child's blanket. The shepherd's body shivered slightly, a physical echo of the past. Yet he remained steadfast, pressing against her crib as if fusing his own warmth into the fragile barrier that separated her from the world. And in the hush of that dim room, the outside world whispered still. Small noises, human or otherwise, ticked against the walls. Each time his body reacted, muscles coiling, head tilting, eyes narrowing, but every time he returned to her side. There was a rhythm to it now, noise, reaction, return, safety reaffirmed. I noticed the subtle ways he began to claim his role, a soft brush of his tail against the floor, as if marking territory. A shift in his weight to cover the crib's draft. A low, almost inaudible rumble when distant sounds grew too sharp, too sudden. The child responded each time, her small hand instinctively patting, smoothing, coaxing him to ease the tension, and he did slowly, deliberately, as though teaching her the language of safety and trust through touch alone. Hours bled into one another. The lamp's glow flickered, shadows stretching, and the baby finally curled completely against him, tiny head resting near his chest. The shepherd exhaled a long, slow breath, trembling slightly but allowing himself the small surrender of near rest. I realized then that this was more than vigilance. It was a partnership, and it had grown faster, stronger, and quieter than I could have imagined. Outside the room, faint noises continued the whisper of lives going on beyond the house. But within these walls, a fragile world had been built. One of trust, of devotion, of unspoken understanding. The shepherd had chosen her. She had chosen him. No human could have intervened to create what was forming here. No circumstance could have forced it. It had grown in silence, in attentiveness, in mutual need. Night deepened further. The shadows pressed against the walls. The wind murmured through broken shutters, and still the shepherd remained beside her crib. Each breath measured, each glance deliberate. The baby slept, clinging to him as naturally as if she had always belonged here. The house itself seemed to lean in, holding its breath along with us, and in the quiet I understood the truth. The past had shaped him. The present was shaping her, and together they were shaping something neither could have imagined alone. Tomorrow the world will return. Voices would speak, doors would open, lives would intrude. But tonight, in the dim lamplight, the storm's echoes fading outside, a bond had been forged too deep to undo. The shepherd had begun to understand the meaning of presence. The child had begun to understand the meaning of trust. And in the hush between breaths, the whispers of the house became something else entirely, a witness to devotion, born quietly, fiercely, and irrevocably. Dawn arrived slowly. The house remained hushed, its walls steeped in the memory of night. Outside, the first muted light pressed gently against the curtains, illuminating the room in a soft grey glow. The storm had long passed, leaving puddles on the cracked pavement and the lingering smell of damp earth. But inside, the air was warmer, still heavier with the quiet persistence of presence. The shepherd had not moved far from the crib. His body remained pressed against its edge, ribs rising and falling in rhythm with the small figure that clung to him. Only now, his movements carried intention beyond mere instinct. Each shift, each tilt of the head, each soft rumble of breath was deliberate, a silent promise he had made without words. The child stirred. Her eyes blinked open, focusing on him, as though seeing him for the first time in full clarity. She stretched her tiny arms and yawned, her hands brushing against his fur. The shepherd responded instantly, leaning closer, pressing his muzzle into her small palm. It was a subtle transformation, but one I could not miss. He was no longer a passive observer, no longer simply enduring for the sake of presence. He was participating. I watched him rise fully, stretching stiff limbs, muscles taut but steady. His paws moved across the floor with the careful precision of someone used to navigating danger. Each step toward the door, each turn in the hallway, was measured. And yet each movement brought him inevitably back to the crib. It was more than protection, it was vigilance. It was recognition. The child babbled, her soft murmurings filling the air like a gentle melody. He responded with subtle gestures, nudging her blanket, adjusting his body to shield her from drafts, shifting his head to catch every small sound beyond the walls. Even when she had not fully woken, he anticipated her needs. By mid-morning, the house seemed to acknowledge the shift. Dust motes danced lazily in the sunbeam that filtered through the broken curtains, moving in time with the soft thud of the shepherd's tail and the rhythmic rise and fall of the baby's breath. Shadows stretched across the worn floorboards, intertwining with the light as though the room itself had become a silent witness to the bond forming within it. I could see it in the tilt of his ears, the subtle tightening of his muscles. He had begun to move not only in response to danger, but in response to her presence. He followed her as she wriggled in the crib, responding to each gesture with patience and careful guidance. It was no longer instinct alone. It was my intention. The baby's tiny hand reached out, brushing against his flank as she tried to roll toward him. He shifted, allowing her to curl closer, repositioning himself so that she could move safely. Her fingers caught the patch of scar near his ear. He flinched slightly but did not withdraw. Instead, he lowered his muzzle, pressing it gently against her hand, and exhaled a soft rumble. It was the first time I noticed the depth of his restraint. He had been through pain far too great to trust easily. Yet here he was, yielding his body to her touch without hesitation. He had become more than a sentinel. He had become a guide, a protector, a quiet companion. I moved closer, keeping a careful distance, not wanting to break the spell. The baby babbled again, reaching out toward him with small, determined hands. He responded with soft nudges, adjusting her blanket, ensuring her arms and legs were free of hazards, subtly correcting her movements without startling her. The house remained silent apart from these gentle exchanges. Each gesture was deliberate, each movement measured. The shepherd was teaching her safety without words, guiding her through the motions of life she had yet to understand, and she, in turn, responded with instinctual trust. By noon, the rhythm of the house had changed. The child sat upright in the crib, small legs swinging. The shepherd remained at her side, moving with her shifts, his head alert to every sound beyond the walls. I realized then that the adults in the house, myself included, had begun to notice subtle changes in him. He no longer flinched at shadows. He no longer trembled at distant noises. His vigilance had shifted from fear to protection. He had become conscious of the child's presence, not just as someone to guard, but as someone to serve. I observed the first truly deliberate interaction between them. The baby dropped a small wooden toy onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the floorboards, a noise that might have startled anyone else. The shepherd froze, ears high, body taut. Then, slowly, he lowered his head, nose brushing the toy gently, nudging it closer to her reach. She clapped, her tiny hands delighted. She reached down and grasped it, bringing it back into her lap. He stayed close, watching every motion, as if ensuring the toy could be safely retrieved without danger. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a quiet revolution. He was no longer reacting only to the world around him. He was learning the rhythm of her world and bending it to her safety. The hours passed in a quiet cadence. The baby babbled continuously, testing her voice, exploring her surroundings, while the shepherd remained at her side, an unwavering presence. Occasionally he would rise, pacing briefly, then return. Each movement is deliberate, each return reaffirming his role. It was remarkable to witness. A dog who had once known abandonment and fear, now mastering the art of guardianship not from necessity, but from devotion. Evening approached, light dimmed to a muted gold, spilling through the cracked curtains in long slats. The baby had grown tired, eyelids drooping, but she still reached out for him. The shepherd allowed her fingers to brush his fur, shifting his body to create space, lowering himself so that she could curl against him comfortably. He had become her shield, not just in the absence of threat, but in the presence of comfort. His vigilance was quiet, deliberate, a constant hum beneath her awareness. And in that stillness, I understood the depth of his transformation. The past had shaped him. Yes, the scars on his body, the shadows in his eyes, but they no longer defined him. The fires he had endured, the nights spent alone, the hands that had abandoned him, all of it had led him here. To this crib, to this child, to this quiet, unspoken bond. He had begun to heal through service, through presence, through connection. The baby drifted into sleep, her small hand still clinging to his fur. The shepherd lowered his head beside her, body curved protectively around her small frame. His tail thudded softly against the floor, a gentle, measured rhythm. Outside, the wind whispered through broken shutters. Distant life continued, unaware of the miracle unfolding inside the room. But here, in this fragile sanctuary, a silent transformation had occurred. He was no longer merely a survivor. He was a guardian. He was a companion. He was family. I remained in the doorway, watching, realizing that this was only the beginning. The story of his past had not yet been fully revealed, and the challenges of the future had not yet arrived. But in the silent way he had adapted to her presence, I saw a promise that whatever came, he would meet it not with fear, not with hesitation, but with devotion. And the child, in turn, would grow to understand the depth of that devotion. Night returned fully. The house was quiet but no longer hollow. Shadows settled gently across the room and the lamp flickered softly. The baby slept, pressed against the shepherd, small and trusting. He exhaled slowly, his body trembling only slightly from fatigue, and lowered his head to rest, curved protectively around her crib. The silent transformation was complete. Tomorrow, the outside world will intrude. People would notice him, question him, and wonder at his presence. But tonight, nothing mattered beyond the warmth of their bond. He had chosen his role. She had accepted it. And together, they had begun a journey. Neither could take alone, but both were destined to walk. Night fell with a heavier weight this time. The house was quieter than usual, yet the silence carried tension, a subtle tremor that could not be ignored. Outside, the wind moved differently, carrying the faint sounds of cars along wet streets, the occasional distant shout, fragments of life pressing against the walls like a reminder that the world beyond was still waiting. Inside, the shepherd remained beside the crib, his body low, ears twitching at every faint noise. He had adapted fully to his role, silent, deliberate, unwavering. But even he could sense that the stillness of the past days was shifting. Something in the air hinted at intrusion, at the inevitability of the world pressing back. The baby slept, small chest rising and falling, fingers curled against his fur. He exhaled slowly, a deep, vibrating rumble that seemed to flow from muscle into memory, an unspoken promise that no harm would reach her. I moved quietly along the hall, glancing toward the doorway. The faint hum of a car engine outside drew his attention. His head lifted slowly, eyes scanning the dim light filtering through the broken shutters. The muscles in his neck tightened. He had survived threats before, fires, neglect, abandonment. But now he faced a different kind of danger, one he could not anticipate entirely, one that came with human hands and rules he could not always understand. He growled softly, not in aggression, but as a warning. His body remained coiled near the crib, every nerve alert. Minutes passed. A shadow moved beyond the window, shifting with the pale reflection of streetlights. The shepherd rose on shaky legs, stiff from hours of vigilance, and pressed his body closer to the crib. His gaze followed the movement, nostrils flaring, muscles taut with readiness. The baby stirred, sensing the shift in his energy. She whimpered softly, small and confused. He leaned closer, pressing his nose gently against her hand, letting her know she was safe. It was a subtle act, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of his entire history. Every scar, every scarred muscle, every shadowed memory had trained him for this moment of uncertainty. Outside, a door creaked, a human voice, a quiet, careful one. It echoed down the hall. Footsteps approached slowly, measured and deliberate. The shepherd froze, head low, ears pricked forward, eyes sharp. He did not move toward the intruder, did not bark. Instead, he assessed, calculated, and remained ready. The child's fingers twitched against his fur. He exhaled a soft, calming rumble that reassured her. She did not cry, did not pull away. She trusted him. And in that trust, he found strength. The figure in the hallway paused. It was a voice I did not recognize, speaking softly to someone else beyond the door. Words too quiet to catch, but tones filled with concern or perhaps suspicion. The shepherd's eyes narrowed. He rose fully, paws splayed, body rigid but poised. He did not retreat, he did not cower. He waited, calculating, protective, ready to act. The baby shifted, her small voice breaking the tension with a soft murmur. The shepherd exhaled slowly, leaning closer to her, letting her fingers trace his fur. He did not relax entirely, but in that tiny gesture he reaffirmed his commitment. Whatever threat approached, he would face it. I could see the subtle changes forming in him. The quiet transformation of the past days had now evolved into something more profound, not just protection, but anticipation. He could sense danger, read its signs, and prepare without panic. The footsteps drew nearer. A door at the far end of the hall opened. The sound echoed faintly through the house. The shepherd stiffened completely, muscles taut, tail low but rigid. His gaze darted toward the crib, ensuring the child remained shielded from any possible threat. And then, almost imperceptibly, he began to move. Not running, not attacking, simply positioning himself. Between the crib and the hall, between the child and whatever might come through that doorway, he created a barrier. It was instinct honed by experience, a calculated act of guardianship that required no words. The baby stirred again, babbling softly. She reached out instinctively toward him, as if sensing the tension, but not its cause. The shepherd responded with the gentlest nudges, adjusting her blanket, pressing himself closer without smothering, creating a protective space for her. It was a delicate balance. One false move, one misjudged reaction, and either could be startled. But he moved with precision, every action deliberate, every motion controlled. I could feel my own pulse quicken, though no one else in the house seemed aware of the subtle threat. The shepherd's attention was absolute, unwavering. Every scent, every shadow, every creak of wood was accounted for. He had become a sentinel, not through fear but through devotion, a devotion so deep it made the air itself feel safer. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The human voice returned, closer now. Concern, frustration, perhaps confusion laced the tones. The shepherd's body coiled further, ready to defend, ready to act if necessary. And the child? She slept, trusting entirely in the presence that had become her anchor. Eventually the footsteps receded. The door clicked softly, then closed. Silence returned, heavier now for the tension that had passed through it. The shepherd remained still, muscles slowly relaxing, tail thudding softly against the floor. His body remained coiled near the crib, but the rigidness softened. He exhaled, long and steady, allowing himself a small measure of relief. The baby shifted in her sleep, tiny fingers tracing his fur once again. He leaned into her touch, head lowering slightly, breathing deep and steady. The danger had passed for now. In that quiet aftermath, I realized the depth of the bond forming before my eyes. The child trusted him completely, even without understanding the potential threats. He trusted himself to protect her, even when the outside world pressed near. This was no longer just instinct or loyalty, it was for a purpose. The house grew still again, night pressed close, wrapping the walls in shadows. The baby's breathing was steady, untroubled. The shepherd lowered his head fully, resting beside the crib, body curved protectively, muscles finally letting go of the tension. The threat had left, but the echo of its presence lingered. And yet he had responded not with panic, not with aggression, but with measured protection. He had learned to navigate danger quietly. He had learned to anticipate it. He had learned to protect, not just endure. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken shutters, carrying with it the faint sounds of distant life. But within the walls of the house, a fragile sanctuary remained. The child slept safely, the shepherd vigilant and steadfast. and I watching. From the doorway realized that what had begun as survival had transformed into something far deeper. He was no longer merely a survivor. He was a protector. He was a guardian. He was family. The night pressed on, but in the dim lamplight, the quiet rhythm of their bond continued. The baby's hand clung to his fur. His head rested lightly against her crib. And somewhere within the stillness, I understood that this bond had already passed its first test. The world outside might intrude again. Threats might return. But tonight, he had proven something unshakable he would endure. He would protect. He would stay, and she would sleep knowing she was safe. Morning broke slowly over the house. The pale light crept across cracked floors and weathered walls, hesitating in corners where shadows still clung. Outside, the world moved forward, cars passing, doors opening, neighbors stirring, but inside the rhythm was different. It had been shaped by two lives learning to coexist in fragile trust, a battered German shepherd and a baby who knew nothing of fear, yet understood instinctively what safety required. The shepherd lay near the crib, head lowered, ears twitching at every distant sound. His body was coiled lightly, ready, alert, but calmer than in previous nights. He had learned the boundaries of the house, the cadence of its sounds, the nuances of its quiet, and in the span of hours and shared breaths, he had learned to anticipate the child's needs without alarm, to respond with careful precision rather than instinct alone. The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling into his fur, eyes blinking open. She cooed softly, a faint murmur that carried unmeasured joy. The shepherd leaned closer, pressing his muzzle into her hand. She smiled, the gesture small, deliberate, intentional. It was the morning of another test, though neither she nor he knew it yet. Footsteps came down the hall, slow and measured, accompanied by soft voices. Adults. Not threats, not strangers, simply human curiosity, concern, and perhaps suspicion. They had begun to notice the shepherd's constant presence, the way he lingered. Near the crib, the way he shifted when the baby moved. I could see and in that, he had finally fully redeemed himself. The morning air pressed cool and damp against the weathered windows. The house, bathed in the quiet glow of early light, seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind rustled through nearby. Trees, shaking loose droplets of dew that glittered faintly in the first beams of the sun. Inside, the room felt like a fragile sanctuary, suspended between past pain and present possibility. The shepherd lay beside the crib, body relaxed in the calm light, yet alert in ways subtle but precise. Every twitch of his ear, every slow exhale, every shift of his weight was deliberate. He had become attuned not just to the child's presence, but to her needs, her moods, the tiny gestures that defined her comfort. The baby stirred, blinking up at him, small hands reaching out instinctively. He nudged her gently, adjusting the blanket to cover her legs, moving with an ease that suggested complete understanding. Today, I sensed, would demand more than calm, watchfulness. Today I would ask for action. The outside world intruded slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Footsteps approached, heavier now, purposeful. Voices carried through the hall words that spoke not of casual concern, but of decisions, choices that could undo what had been quietly built. The shepherd lifted his head, ears flicking forward. His eyes scanned the room, then the doorway. Every muscle coiled lightly, ready, attentive. The baby shifted against him, sensing the tension. Her small hand gripped his fur with instinctual trust. He exhaled slowly, letting her know she was safe, even as his body braced for the unknown. The door opened. Two adults entered, eyes wary, faces etched with unease. Papers clutched in one hand, gestures careful, measured. The shepherd rose slightly, body tense, positioning himself fully between the child and the intruders. Not a growl, not a bark. Only presence, deliberate and immovable. The baby babbled softly and he leaned closer, pressing his head gently against her chest. A shield, a promise, a living testament. I watched, holding my breath, as the adults froze, uncertain how to proceed. The papers in their hands were meant to command action, to enforce rules, to decide fates. But here was something neither law nor rule could dictate: a bond forged in survival, trust, and devotion. One adult spoke first, voice careful, almost reverent. "We need to talk about him," they said, gesturing toward the shepherd. "He can't stay here, officially, you understand, right?" The shepherd's ears twitched. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of the human words. Yet his body remained between the child and them. Posture firm, gaze unwavering. The baby reached out, tiny fingers brushing his fur. He responded with a nudge, pressing her closer, as though reinforcing the boundaries he had silently claimed over the past days. I stepped forward, quietly. No words could fully explain the depth of what had formed in the room, but I tried anyway. "He's not just a dog," I said softly, almost whispering. "He's her protector. He's everything she needs right now." The adults exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Rules, procedures, rationality, everything that had guided them until now clashed with the undeniable reality before them. A battered, scarred German shepherd had chosen this child, and she had chosen him in return. The room seemed to hold its breath. The baby shifted in her sleep, hand curling into his fur. The shepherd exhaled softly, a vibration of calm reassurance, his body settling further into protective proximity. The discussion continued, voices low, careful. The shepherd's gaze remained fixed on the child. Every time a foot moved too close, every time a hand reached toward her, his body responded subtly but decisively, shifting, blocking, nudging, aligning himself as a shield. The adult spoke of regulations, liabilities, temporary arrangements, but none of it mattered in the presence of what had been built silently over days. Here was loyalty distilled into action. Here was devotion made visible in posture and breath. Minutes stretched. The baby stirred, then babbled small tentative sounds that drew the shepherd's attention. He nudged her gently, lowering his head so she could press against him, anchoring her in calm. And at that moment the tension in the room seemed to shift slightly. The adults softened. They saw what I had seen, what I had felt, that the bond between the child and this creature was not something to be dismissed. It was a living thing, fragile and strong, tender and resolute. One adult knelt slowly, not to confront, not to dominate, but to observe, to understand. The shepherd's gaze flicked to them, assessing, measuring intent. The baby's small hand reached out instinctively. He leaned into her touch, allowing the gesture, letting her establish trust. The adult's expression softened. Hesitation became reflection. The papers they had clutched, the rules that had guided their hands, began to feel weightless in the presence of what truly mattered: a child safe, a life protected, a redemption quietly earned. I spoke again, voice steady but low. "He's not just guarding her, he's teaching her trust, he's giving her confidence, he's giving her the chance to grow without fear." The baby stirred once more, babbling with soft delight. The shepherd's eyes followed her every movement, body coiled lightly, tail brushing the floor, ears alert. Yet within that vigilance was serenity. He had found purpose beyond survival. He had found a reason to endure, and the adults could see it now. A decision hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. The rules, the papers, the procedure, all of it mattered less than what was before them. A battered dog had earned his place, not through obedience, not through pedigree, not through command, but through loyalty, devotion, and quiet heroism. The baby reached up, tiny fingers curling around his ear, brushing the scarred fur with delicate insistence. The shepherd responded, a soft exhale vibrating through his chest, leaning into her touch. And I realized then that the final choice would not be made by law or logic or fear, but by recognition of love, trust, and courage. The adults exchanged one final look. Words were unnecessary. Action would speak for them. Slowly, carefully, one set of hands extended, not to command, not to claim, but to accept. The shepherd's gaze met theirs, assessing, reading intent. No hesitation, no aggression, just trust, measured and earned. The decision was made quietly, irrevocably. He would stay. The baby yawned, tiny body curling against him. He shifted, slightly, adjusting, pressing close, creating the protective arc that had become instinctual. His eyes scanned the room one final time before settling fully on her. A living sentinel, guardian, and companion. The adults stepped back, acceptance softening their features. The papers they carried were no longer instruments of command. They were irrelevant to the bond forming here. The room exhaled with them. For the first time, he lowered his head fully, allowing himself to rest while still remaining vigilant. The baby slept, hand resting against his muzzle. His tail thudded softly against the floorboards, a gentle rhythm that echoed through the quiet house. He had survived fires, neglect, abandonment. He had endured hunger, cold, loneliness. And now, in the quiet light of dawn, he had achieved something far greater: redemption. Not through heroic feats, not through loud declarations, not through conquest or triumph, but through presence, devotion, and unflinching loyalty. The outside world continued, distant and persistent. But inside this fragile house, something sacred had been forged: trust, courage, and a bond that neither time nor circumstance could undo. He had chosen her. She had chosen him. And together, they had rewritten the definition of home, safety, and love. Night would return, storms might follow, and life would continue beyond these walls. But in the quiet sanctuary of this room, in the tender light of morning, the shepherd had proven, fully and irrevocably, that he could endure, protect, and love without fail. And the baby slept, untroubled and safe, cradled in the living embodiment of redemption. The evening settled like a soft blanket over the house. Shadows pooled gently in corners, stretching across worn floorboards. The golden light from the lamp bathed the crib in a quiet glow, illuminating the sleeping child and the guardian who had become her anchor. The shepherd lay curled beside her, head resting lightly against the edge of the crib. His fur, still, bearing the marks of past hardships, shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Each breath rose and fell with measured rhythm, a soft hum of life and vigilance that had become the heartbeat of this room. I watched from the doorway, reluctant to intrude, but unable to look away. The days of fear, of uncertainty, of quiet tension had passed. What remained was something tender and unspoken: trust, devotion, and the fragile beauty of connection forged through suffering and survival. The child stirred, small fingers brushing the scarred fur near his ear. He shifted gently, nudging, her hand toward his muzzle. She babbled softly, a language beyond words, a conversation of touch and presence. He responded with patience, leaning into her tiny movements as though reaffirming a promise she had not yet learned to speak. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken shutters. Rain had returned in the night, tapping lightly against the windows, yet inside there was warmth, safety, and quiet assurance. The shepherd had transformed fully, gone were the tremors of fear, the shadows of distrust. In their place, a steadfast devotion glimmered quietly, evident in every gesture, every adjustment, every subtle shift to ensure the child's comfort. I reflected on how far he had come. Once abandoned, once trembling, once scarred by neglect and fire, he had become something more than a survivor. He had become a guardian, protector, companion, silent teacher. He had endured not for himself but for her, and in doing so, he had found redemption that needed no words. The adults had left for the evening, their presence replaced by the gentle hum of night. Alone in this room, I felt the weight of the bond that had been forged here, a bond that could not be broken by rules, by time, or by circumstance. The baby yawned, curling closer. The shepherd shifted slightly to accommodate her, head lowering gently, eyes soft but still vigilant. His tail thudded softly against the floor, a quiet metronome marking the rhythm of protection. For a moment, the past seemed to dissolve the nights of fear, the shadows of neglect, the fires that had left scars. All of it had led him here, to this quiet, golden room, to this child who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. He exhaled slowly, resting fully for the first time in days, body relaxed but ready, eyes half closed. She reached up, fingers, brushing his fur one last time before sleep, fully claimed her. And in that simple gesture, all tension, all fear, all uncertainty melted away. Outside, the wind whispered through the night. Inside, a quiet warmth persisted. The shepherd's vigilance continued, but now it was tempered by trust, calm, and fulfillment. I realized then that stories like this rarely conclude with fanfare or applause. Redemption often comes quietly, without recognition, without spectacle. But in moments like this, small, intimate, unobserved, it is absolute, complete and profound. The night stretched on. The baby slept peacefully, held in the protective ark of her guardian. And in that stillness, I understood something essential. The past could not be erased, but the present could be shaped. Loyalty, devotion, and love could heal what fear had broken, and the shepherd, once lost, had found himself in the act of giving safety, comfort, and trust. The lamplight dimmed slightly, shadows lengthening. Outside, the first hint of dawn glimmered on the horizon, though it remained hours away. Inside, life continued in slow, deliberate rhythm, the baby breathing softly, the shepherd exhaling in. Response, each attuned to the other's presence. I whispered softly, almost to myself, "You've earned this." He did not respond in words, but the subtle shift of his body, the gentle rumble in his chest, and the slight wag of his tail spoke volumes. Tonight they were safe. Tonight they were whole, and the quiet promise of tomorrow waited, ready to be met with unwavering devotion. The house had fallen into a serene stillness. Night pressed softly against the windows, a muted rhythm of shadows and light. Rain whispered along the rooftops, droplets tracing gentle patterns across the glass. Inside, the air was warmer, calmer, touched by the quiet presence of life and trust. The shepherd lay curled fully beside the crib, body relaxed, muscles no longer taut with vigilance, but still attentive in subtle ways only the child could sense. His head rested lightly against the crib's edge, eyes half closed, tail thudding faintly against the floor, a soft, steady heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. The baby, small and fragile, slept curled against him, fingers brushing the scarred fur near his ear. Her breath rose and fell gently, fogging the faint light from the lamp. She had learned in the most instinctive and profound way that he would not leave her, that he would endure, protect, and remain. It had been a long journey. From trembling, beginnings in the shadows, from nights spent alone, from scars carried in muscle and memory, he had endured. Each fire, each loss, each moment of fear had brought him closer to this, a purpose beyond survival, a reason to endure beyond instinct. The adults had finally accepted what was already true. The bond between the child and the shepherd was unspoken, unbreakable, and complete. Rules, doubts, and uncertainty had dissolved before the quiet force of loyalty and trust. I watched from the doorway, hesitant to intrude, aware that this moment could not be disturbed. Every gesture, every exhale, every subtle movement mattered. This was the culmination of days filled with vigilance, patience, and quiet transformation. The baby shifted slightly in her sleep. Her small hand traced his fur in a gentle arc. The shepherd responded instantly, leaning into her touch, adjusting his body to maintain comfort and warmth. It was an instinct now refined into devotion, a silent communication that required no words. Outside, the storm's remnants faded into the night. Distant city sounds filtered through broken shutters, cars, wind, the occasional dog barking, but inside the room remained a sanctuary, shielded by the steadfast presence of one devoted guardian. I realized then that the true measure of survival is not simply living, but becoming capable of love, trust, and devotion again. He had survived, yes. But more than that, he had thrived, not for himself, but for her. Time passed, unnoticed. Minutes, blurred, soft as whispers. The child slept, small body curled protectively against him, and he remained awake, ever watchful, but calm. His eyes followed every shadow, every flicker of movement, while his body relaxed enough to rest, yet never fully let go of responsibility. It was an equilibrium only earned through experience, patience, and sacrifice. He had learned to balance vigilance with trust, protection with tenderness. He had learned that the world could intrude, that threats might return, but that his devotion was a constant that could not be shaken. The baby's fingers twitched, brushing his fur one last time before full sleep claimed her. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, letting the tension of the past days drain away. His head rested lightly against her crib, tail thudding faintly, body curved protectively. He was fully present, fully vigilant, yet entirely at peace. In that stillness, the story of pain, fear, and abandonment reached its quiet conclusion. Redemption was no longer a hope, a possibility, or a whispered dream. It was reality, alive in the small gestures between child and dog, in the measured breaths and shared warmth that filled the room. I stepped closer, careful not to disturb the fragile moment. Every instinct told me to be silent, to let the bond unfold unbroken. I knelt slightly, observing the curve of his body, the rise and fall of her small chest. Light from the lamp caught the glint in his eyes, the subtle scars along his flanks, and I realized fully the journey that had brought him here. Every night spent alone, every trembling hour in fear, every scar carried silently, they had all led to this quiet, unassuming, absolute love and devotion. Outside, the wind softened to a whisper. The storm had left only gentle reminders of its presence, droplets on the window, a faint scent of damp earth, a quietness that made the room feel insulated from the world. Inside, life continued in a soft rhythm, the baby's breathing, the shepherd's heartbeat, the subtle brush of fur against blankets. He had endured, he had protected, he had loved without hesitation. And in return, he had been accepted, trusted, and acknowledged not through grand gestures, not through loud declarations, but through the quiet, unwavering bond that neither time nor circumstance could undo. I watched her stir slightly, a small yawn, tiny hands curling into the shepherd's fur. He responded instinctively, nudging her gently, adjusting his body to accommodate her comfort. She babbled softly, a sound full of innocence, trust, and delight. And he, ever vigilant, exhaled a long, quiet rumble of affirmation. In that moment, the room held the sum of their journey. Fear had been transformed into trust. Isolation had been replaced by companionship. Pain had given way to love, devotion, and redemption. The night pressed on, gentle and unwavering. The house, worn and weathered, seemed to exhale with them, acknowledging the quiet miracle of presence, of protection, of love earned and shared. The shepherd's head rested lightly against the crib. His eyes, half closed, remained watchful, but serene. The baby slept, small chest rising and falling in rhythm with him. Outside, the world continued, distant, persistent. But inside, life had reached a delicate equilibrium, a quiet sanctuary built from survival, trust, and devotion. And in the final moments of that night, I realized something essential. Not all stories are concluded with grandeur. Not all heroism is celebrated with applause. Some stories end quietly, in the soft press of fur against skin, in the gentle rise and fall of a child's chest, in the unwavering presence of a guardian who has earned his place in a life that once offered only uncertainty and pain. Redemption does not always announce itself. Sometimes it breathes softly, hums quietly, and waits patiently for recognition. Tonight, it was fully recognized. The baby stirred one last time, reaching out instinctively. The shepherd nudged her hand, a gentle gesture of assurance. She nestled against him, eyelids closing, trust complete, surrender absolute. He exhaled, a soft, long breath, finally allowing himself to rest entirely, confident in the unspoken promise. Between them I will stay. I will protect. I will endure. And she, small and unknowing, would grow safe, nurtured, and loved. The lamplight dimmed softly, shadows stretching and blending across the walls. Rain continued its quiet song against the windows. The house held its breath in the gentle rhythm of life restored. And in that room, where trust had been earned, love had been forged, and redemption had been realized, the story reached its final. Silent note. A baby slept. A German shepherd rested. A quiet bond whispered across the room, unbroken, unshakable, eternal. And the night carried them gently forward.